now for you once again. An explosion underground in the garage section of the World Trade Center in New York City.
The first attack on the Trade Center in '93 was the first thing that woke everybody up in terms of the threat of terrorism.
We said, this is not a one-time event. There is a larger movement here, and they're planning on doing more.
The terrorists were burying themselves inside the ballooning communications network and the internet and the phones, and so we had to figure out who was communicating with whom and who were the terrorists, and that was the whole idea of the Thin Thread program.
Of all the analysts, Bill was by far the most astute.
He was the person in the agency who knew the most about metadata.
It was pretty clear that we were building the most powerful analysis tool that had been developed in history to monitor basically the entire world.
This little research organization had the keys to NSA's future.
We let it run 24 to 36 hours. We discovered critical intelligence that had never been discovered by NSA. NSA's response completely shut the program down.
Does anybody even recognize what they have?
Oh my God, the whole tower collapsed. It is gone.
We would have caught the people. 9/11 would have been avoided.
They're taking data on every U.S. citizen in the country. That's not compatible with a democracy. It's like the Stasi on super steroids.
What's wrong with this picture?
9/11 is a gift to NSA. We're going to get all the money we need and then some.
It wasn't about making money. It was about protecting the country and the free world.
Let's find where the skeletons are, capture it all, and then bury the report as deep as possible.
The FBI decided to raid 4 people. Fabricated evidence to get a warrant. They were after all material that was related to Thin Thread.
It was the largest failure in NSA history.
Hello, I'm Ann, and this is
Lynn.
And we are here with Mr. William Binney, who the movie A Good American was made about, filmed in France, produced by Oliver Stone. We're at a screening here in Manhattan, and we would like to ask Mr. Binney the question as why it's important for this screening to happen in New York City, the greatest city on the earth.
Well, I think that the primary reason is that it talks about the technology behind the ability to detect threats of any kind, either criminal or military or whatever, including all the terrorist attacks that we've had even before 9/11. That technology was known and available in the 1990s. And it was rejected because it didn't cost a lot of money to do. And so our entire government went the bulk acquisition way, and that buried them in so much data they can't see anything coming. And so that's the state we are in. That's why the attack, just recent attack, was should have been picked up through an inductive logic approach, against using the techniques we had already developed. But it wasn't, and it wasn't because they neglected the direct method of targeting and went for bulk acquisition on everybody.
Can you then talk a little bit about this program, which is called titled Thin Thread, that's your program, and which is what this film is about, and what the difference it is perhaps between when you had it and what you intend to do with it, and now what it's being used for, which is global universal surveillance.
Yeah, Thin Thread was originally designed by us to eliminate anything that wasn't relevant, and also anything that was domestic. So unless you were in some way a known target and associated with it in a social network, this is the deductive approach, where you were connected directly or indirectly through at least one hop or 2 degrees of separation from a known bad guy. That limited the scope of what you were looking at. So it was highly relevant that highly potentially that you were involved in that activity, and so that meant you had to be looked at. So, and if you weren't known to be a part of it, and all of your data was encrypted so that you couldn't tell who you were, even in NSA they wouldn't be able to tell. So that, but they could still watch what you're doing and see what you were involved in to build probable cause, and then target you and say, here is the probable cause for this person to be included in this terrorist activity or whatever. And so that would then raise our interest in you as a target, and then we start targeting you with a warrant. And so that was the deductive approach. The inductive approach was one would have worked on the recent attack here, It would be somebody who was visiting a website that was advocating pedophilia or terrorism or bomb making or any kind of threat kind of activity. If you keep visiting those sites, then the potential of you being involved is also there, and that's called the inductive approach. Would have picked up that fellow last week or so. And then the abductive is a little more obscure, but it simply meant you could look at the relationships of a social network and just look at the geographic distributions, for example, and say, well, this looks like it's populating or connecting the areas where terrorism is predominant or where dope smuggling is occurring, and those kinds of distributions of networks would then would then raise that community to a point where you want to look at to make sure it's not a part of that activity. So that's the abductive approach. So far, the deductive and inductive approach would have gotten every terrorist that has ever committed a crime anywhere in the world, even before 9/11.
So this is a film about which our lives now today revolves around, and it's. Can you just say something about why people should see it?
Well, I think it needs to. If you see, the reason I made this film was pretty much writing something about it didn't quite. People can't quite understand things in writing or even in a radio show or a short TV show. You can't really see or understand what's behind all of this. But putting it in a movie makes it create visual displays so you can begin to visually understanding things. People of many backgrounds can visually understand things much more easily than if they read it or try to hear people talking about it.
It's like the side of the building just blew out, Chet, on the other side, the side we can't see. Look at it.
The NSA was actually playing catch up. They were so way behind the time. NSA management seriously considered, no kidding, as to whether or not they would actually give people email technology. And the reason is we don't know what they're going to send to each other.
One of the main reasons we get into war is by mistakes by leadership because they're informed incorrectly or they're uninformed about events, totally. So the principle I thought that I was working under was to make sure that the information that I could arrive at through the work I did was informative to leadership so they didn't make mistakes.
And now we welcome Mr. Ray McGovern.
Hi.
How are you, sir?
Not bad.
These two gentlemen have formed the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And would you like to add anything to what your friend Mr. Binney has just been saying as far as being in Manhattan and having this movie screening here today? In the present day, with what we're concerned with as far as the Russian hacking, supposed Russian hacking goes?
Well, what I would say is that this is a very, very important subject. It's almost quintessentially important because it has to do with our privacy and our freedoms. And the film depicts in a very, very close way what can happen, what Edward Snowden called turnkey tyranny, when you have something on everyone and you can just turn that key and you can control everyone. So I think here in Midtown Manhattan is about the best place to do this, and the film, of course, is going to be very exciting. I've seen it several times.
I heard Vice President Cheney's statement about we have to go to the dark side. I looked at it as a total destruction of our society, and we lost all moral standing in the world as a result of going to the dark side.
Well, with regard to the hacking, I mean, I need to get into the hacking because that's a false narrative being pushed by a number of people, mostly the military intelligence complex, and also their contracting people, all of the shadow government and the shadow military industrial complex. That's all involved in this. There's a lot of money involved in this. And so they have a really high interest in creating a new Cold War because that will mean a couple more $1 trillion in their pockets. And they're trying to create some kind of narrative that would create that friction between the U.S. and Russia. And so that's why we VIPs felt it was very important to look at that, to try to find some evidence to see what was really right. And the only evidence we've found, and nobody else has ever produced any evidence, by the way, not NSA, not FBI, not CIA. Only we are the ones who have come out with anything publicly that is evidence of what happened. And that was on the 5th of July of 2016 with the first download there of about 16 gigabits of data in 87 seconds in 2 takes. And so from all of the material we had there was clearly something that couldn't go across the network anywhere. In fact, we tried to do that. We tried physically to actually transfer data from the US to Europe. The best we got there was from a data center to another data center in the UK, one in New Jersey to the UK. And that was like 1/4 the capacity necessary to get the data there. So then we tried it even further east, like in Amsterdam, and got less capability, something like 1/16 the capacity. And then we went over to Belgrade and Albania, and didn't even try because the capacity wasn't anywhere near. It was like dial-up, you know. You couldn't get anything out of it, so it wasn't even worth trying. We, through our trials, showed that we couldn't transfer that data with the rate at which it came down. And so what that meant very simply is that that transfer was local. It didn't go anywhere beyond the high-speed capacity of the lines of the DNC. So it was downloaded, in our view, onto some storage device, which is the rate the transfer was matches that storage thumb drive download. It's clearly something that happened local, and it didn't go anywhere because and also this is the curious part about it. If it did go across anywhere after it was downloaded locally, then NSA would have a record of it, and they've been seriously quiet about all this stuff. And again, I would emphasize that any kind of attack, now that the Bolt 7 is out, and now that the NSA hacks are out, and by the Shadow Group or whatever it was, and so that means they're on the web. That means everybody has them. That means if any of those attacks are used, it doesn't mean that NSA or CIA did it, but now it means any hack in the world, you've got to follow the packets and trace the packets to where they went. That's the only way you're going to know who did it. And so far, NSA has said absolutely nothing about the packets going anywhere. That's because all the evidence we had said they didn't go anywhere.
So I'd just like to bring up our history of the past and President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said, beware the military intelligence complex. And your gentleman's history of your occupation and how we got to this point and what our presidents have done in recent history to either abet or avoid what we're going through right now.
Well, actually, one of the interesting things is that President Eisenhower wanted to say military-industrial congressional complex, right? And his advisor said, oh, come on, military-industrial complex, that's bad enough. What do you want to get, you don't want to leave and just be safe? And so he cut it down to military-industrial complex. Now, it's not only the military-industrial congressional, but it's the deep state intelligence, it's the mass media, it's all that, all thrown in together. So you've got a military-industrial complex on steroids, and indeed President Trump and others are if they're going to grapple with this, there's an open question as to whether they could succeed in controlling it.
Yeah, I'd like to add one other thing. Since as many members, or a number of members of Congress, our current Congress, have been saying that this Russian hacking is an act of war, I would remind everybody that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy released the U-2 photographs, classified U-2 photographs of the missiles in Cuba. So, I mean, that was a serious situation. And then in the early 80s, President Reagan, after the Russians shot down the Korean airline over Sakhalin Island, released the Japanese recordings of the air-to-ground control of the fighter aircraft, the Russian aircraft, where they told them to shoot it down. And that was also classified, SIGINT classification. So, but it was Japanese collection, and so it simply means if you're going to say this is an act of war, you better start producing the evidence, because we need to know for sure. Otherwise, we're going to be thrown into another Vietnam where it was a false justification, or another Iraq where the WMD's slam dunk from the intelligence community was absolutely false. So, you know, this is serious, okay? Produce the evidence.
There was no hope whatsoever. Trapped on 94 floors all the way up.
The walls just blew in, and everything went blank after that. Walls collapsed, furniture's down. It's a mess downstairs.
In 2005, Trailblazer was declared an abject failure, having wasted billions of dollars. It was the largest failure in NSA history. People don't realize that. And yet, General Hayden, who presided over the largest failure in NSA history, was promoted to a higher position of authority, made Deputy Director of National Intelligence, and then promoted again and made Director of Central Intelligence. It is odd when mankind promotes failure. Something is wrong.
And so obviously for our guests here, we'll go Mr. William Binney at the end. He's a 30-year veteran of the National Security Agency, as you hopefully know by now, having watched the film. Top mathematician, cryptologist, and the creator of the program, Thin Thread. He was a Russia specialist, which is interesting, and particularly in this time period. Mr. Ray McGovern, you've maybe caught on RT and other Democracy Now! And all these other channels. The mainstream media doesn't like the fact that he founded this Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which basically challenges the status quo thinking of our intelligence services. But he himself is a long-time CIA case officer. I was a mid-level officer who he was in charge of preparing daily security briefings for the vice presidents. And Mrs. Diane Rourke, Republican staffer on the House Intelligence Committee from 1985 to 2002. And obviously you saw her as well.
We have to get real encryption as a first step. And we can't have the government be objecting to that. And you know, there's been a big fight with a lot of the IT firms about this, because they've been wanting them to build a backdoor into their stuff and letting them in. And you can't build a backdoor that only the US government can get into, or that only Google or somebody can get into. It's impossible. Somebody else can find it. So, you know, this whole effort by the FBI and the Department of Justice in particular to put the kibosh on really effective encryption has to be confronted. And the other thing is, the second thing is that we need the IT community to focus in particular on really usable safeguards for the ordinary person who does not know a whole lot about IT, but also for businesses, because they've been taken to the cleaners so many times.
So the day after 9/11, I came in dressed like I was going to sweep the floor, so the guards let me in. Otherwise, they would have kept me out then, too, because that day that General Hayden had ordered everybody out of the building, too. So when I got in there, I went up to the SARC, and while I was in there trying to look at the material on my computer, my president of the contracting group that I had working on Thin Thread came over to me and said that he had just been in a contractor meeting with Sam Visner. And in that meeting, Sam Visner had told him that, he said to him, "Do not embarrass large companies. You do your part, you'll get your share. There's plenty for everybody." And he also said that Sam had said that we could milk this cow for 15 years. It was just sad. Still is.